my understanding the defendant has an additional record she wishes to make.
Just related to the parameters and the discussion about the special limiting instruction. The idea of this being general intent, I mean, there's case law out there that says, generally speaking, child endangerment is a general intent crime, but the application of it specifically to 726.61b, I'm finding wanting. And there's a characteristic difference between B versus all the other forms of child endangerment. Obviously, the other forms, I would agree, were general intent crimes, but this one, that number one, is identified by the legislature as the specific form that qualifies for the felony murder rule, and number two is identified just recently by the legislature as the one that requires special punishment. It says an intentional act or series of acts. Again, instead of knowingly or willfully, it says the intentional act of torture, the intentional act of cruelty. I believe there's a better argument that this may well dovetail into the specific intent arena. That doesn't change the testimony of Dr. O'Hara and what we said before, Your Honor. But I do think that the idea of arguing that it's not intentional and that the idea that this specific form of child endangerment may well qualify as specific intent exists.
Your statement that this isn't going to change Dr. O'Hara's testimony, so this argument is more going to go to whether I'm going to instruct on specific intent.
Right, in the parameters of argument, Your Honor. So I just wanted to make sure we talked about that now, given the discussion that we had.
All right. Any further record you wish to make on that, Ms. Timmons?
No, assuming we'll be able to argue this later.
We will definitely argue it later. Ready for the jury?
We are, Your Honor.
All right, please go get the jury. Be seated. And good morning. I hope everyone had a pleasant weekend, even though the football game was boring. I hope you still enjoyed the weekend. I have spoken with the attorneys. Defendant has 3 witnesses they'll be calling. The state may have a rebuttal, but it does sound like they have every intention of getting all of the evidence submitted today, which will mean we'll work on jury instructions this afternoon outside of your presence and be able to do closing arguments first thing in the morning and have the case submitted to you before noon tomorrow. So just to keep you an idea of where we're going to be, you should have the case for deliberation tomorrow. Okay? Is the defendant ready to proceed?
Yes, Your Honor.
Call your first witness.
Thank you, Your Honor. The defense calls Dr. Michael O'Hara.
Have to raise your right hand. Promise testimony you're about to give will be the truth and nothing but the truth.
Yes.
Have a seat. Mr. Hawbaker.
Thank you, Your Honor. All right, Dr. O'Hara, you might need to be a little closer to the mic if possible. Can you state your name, please?
Yes, my name is Michael William O'Hara.
And can you give us a brief outline of your education?
Yes. I graduated with a bachelor's degree in psychology from the University of Memphis in 1974, and then I received my PhD in clinical psychology in 1980 from the University of Pittsburgh.
And how about professionally? Can you give us an outline of your professional experience?
Yes. So I am a licensed clinical psychologist in the state of Iowa. I have been a faculty member at the University of Iowa in the Department of Psychological and Brain Sciences since 1980, so about 39 years. My area of expertise is the mental health of women during pregnancy and the postpartum period. That's work that I've been doing since really 1979, 1980, and I continue that today. So that work includes trying to understand the causes of depression during pregnancy and the postpartum period. It includes understanding how common it is. It includes methods for treating women with mental health problems during pregnancy and the postpartum period.
And did you prepare a curriculum vitae for today that kind of outlines all of your educational and professional history?
I did, yes.
And did you provide that to us?
I did, yes.
Is that an accurate reflection of a fairly lengthy history in the field?
Yes, it is.
Okay. Your Honor, we'd move for the admittance of Defendant's Exhibit A.
Any objection? A is admitted.
There's a brief reference to it in that document, but you're also a veteran, is that correct?
That's correct.
And what branch did you serve in?
The Navy.
Okay. Did you provide counseling services while you were in the Navy?
Yes. Back in the early 1970s, when we were experiencing a lot of problems with sailors and other service persons coming back from the Philippines and Vietnam with substance abuse problems, the military established counseling centers around the U.S. and overseas bases. I was selected to be trained as a substance abuse counselor during that time, and did that for about the last year and a half that I was serving in the Navy.
And I'm guessing, given your field, it is not uncommon to come across people with both mental health disorders and substance abuse issues.
That's right. It's in fact, it's very common. There's a term for that is called comorbidity, and it basically means when two disorders, mental health disorders, or a mental health disorder and a substance abuse disorder occur roughly at the same time. And sometimes the direction of cause goes in one direction, or sometimes it goes in the other. So sometimes a mental health problem can lead to substance abuse problems, and sometimes substance abuse problems can lead to other mental health problems.
Does the term self-medicate mean something to you?
Self-medicate is, I would say, a layperson's term, and it basically means using substances that may be legal or illegal to manage distress and other aspects of mental illness. So we often talk about alcohol as being self-medication for depression, or certainly other kinds of substances. So it's commonly understood that way.
Right. Now, obviously, we contacted you to employ your services, fair?
That's correct.
Is providing testimony in a setting like this, is that something that's a normal part of your job?
No, it is not. The normal part of my job is to really teach our undergraduate and graduate students, to supervise our clinical psychology students in our training clinic, and to do research. This kind of activity is very, very uncommon and infrequent in my career.
You supervise the clinic. Does that mean that you have, I guess what I would say, as opposed to the academic work that you do, but you also have sort of the real-world application of what you do? Is that right?
That's right. So we have a clinic in the Department of Psychology at the University of Iowa. This is where we train clinical psychology graduate students who go on then to practice, many of them in the state of Iowa. One of my responsibilities since I joined the faculty is to oversee their clinical work, to observe it, to comment on it, and to help them become proficient as clinicians. So that's a big part of my teaching. It's a teaching responsibility, but yes, that's what I do.
I was reminded I should have followed up about the amount. How many times have you testified in a court setting such as this?
As a professional psychologist, twice.
Okay. So it's not unusual for people in your field to pursue income by offering themselves as experts. Is that fair?
Yes, that's fair to say. There's an entire branch of psychology called forensic psychology, where that's really a lot of what these people do.
Okay. But you're not one of those people. You're not a hired gun in that regard.
No.
All right, let me ask you this. What's the difference between a psychologist and a psychiatrist?
Well, a psychologist is an individual who has received graduate level training in psychology, and if we're speaking specifically of clinical psychology, that would include generally at least 5 or 6 years of academic training, along with practical training in our clinic, as well as practicum placements. So, for example, in our setting, we would have graduate students seeing patients in the hospital, in the Department of Psychiatry, in the Department of Neurology, at the Veterans Administration Hospital, in other settings. So they're trained to both be a researcher on mental health as well as develop professional skills. And when they finish with our on-site training academically and clinically, then they'll do a year of supervised clinical internship. Usually it's at a medical center or a VA hospital. And then after that, they usually need to do 1 year of supervised postdoctoral training before they can become licensed to practice. A psychiatrist is a physician, a medical doctor, who has gone through medical school and then has done a residency in psychiatry. Typically they're 4 years, and then after that he or she is eligible for board certification. Probably in terms of professional practice, a major difference is that psychiatrists are, since they're physicians, they can prescribe and manage medications. Clinical psychologists generally do not do that.
When it comes to diagnosing somebody with a mental illness, does it really matter whether it's a psychologist or a psychiatrist?
Usually not. The standards that we use and the guidelines that drive our diagnoses are essentially the same. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of 5th edition is the current guide for psychiatric diagnosis. We train our students to approach diagnosis in that way. We have other sorts of training as well, but in terms of diagnosis, I would say there's very, very little difference.
All right, you performed an evaluation of Ms. Harris in this case.
That's right.
Okay. Did you meet with her in person?
I did.
Okay. And how long did you spend with her?
Approximately 2.5 hours.
And what was the purpose of that evaluation?
Well, I was asked to evaluate her to provide some idea of her mental state at the time of the offense, that around the time that her son died.
And I believe in your report you focused essentially on the month prior to the realization that Sterling had passed. Is that fair?
Yes, that is fair. However, it was important to me to provide some context for that month. So I did a pretty in-depth discussion with her about her personal history to try to understand how that month came to be.
And as part of that evaluation and the obtaining the personal history, did you also interview others to verify what was explained to you?
Yes, I did interview Ms. Harris's mother. I did that on the telephone. We spent about 30 minutes. Beyond that, I examined a variety of records that were made available to me, interviews, depositions, hospital records, and evaluations by others. I looked at a good bit of information that bore on Ms. Harris's mental condition at the time when the baby died.
So you had a lot of other information available to you besides that lengthy interview with Ms. Harris, correct?
That's right.
other testing, other information from other people, that sort of thing?
Yes.
Did you perform any specific tests on Ms. Harris?
I gave her two brief questionnaires that address level of depressive symptoms and level of anxiety symptoms. I wanted to have a good idea of her mental state at the time I actually did the interview with her. So I used a measure called the Beck Depression Inventory, which is a very commonly used measure of depression. It's filled out by the individual, and a Beck Anxiety Inventory. The results were that she showed what I would call moderate levels of depressive and anxious symptoms, particularly on the depression side. Many of those, when I examined the individual items, reflected the fact that she was incarcerated, so they were not terribly surprising. But it was my judgment that she was able to to participate fully in this evaluation, so I didn't have any reservations about continuing on.
And that's the purpose for that testing, is to make sure that you'll have an effective interview with Ms. Harris.
That's correct.
Based upon that interview with Ms. Harris, based upon the information that you had at your hand, the additional testing, interviews of others, medical records, those sorts of things, did you eventually arrive at a diagnosis or diagnoses for Ms. Harris?
Yes. So there were really three diagnoses that seemed to capture her mental condition. One was major depression at a severe level, recurrent, with what we call peripartum onset, which simply means an episode that begins during pregnancy or early in the postpartum period. Second diagnosis was post-traumatic stress disorder, or what's often called PTSD. And the third diagnosis was essentially substance abuse, severe, with stimulant medication, methamphetamine in particular.
Now, let's talk about those a little bit out of order. Can you describe generally what post-traumatic stress disorder is?
Post-traumatic stress disorder is a disorder that we've recognized now for quite a long time. It is usually thought to begin with some sort of a traumatic experience. The prototypical, or the most common ones, would be, for example, if we're working with veterans, it'd be some sort of a military combat, seeing a friend die, for example. For women, a very common trauma would be sexual assault, sexual violence, chronic sexual abuse. These events are usually very dramatic, at least as far as the person is concerned, and then lead to or are associated with a number of other, what we thoughts come in, thinking about it and being very upset about it. Often it would include getting very upset and aroused by anything that seemed similar to it. So being in a similar circumstance, or just being around people who were like a perpetrator in the case of a sexual assault. These things can be very, very distressing and upsetting. And then we see other symptoms that are things like problems with sleeping, being very anxious and irritable, and having very impaired interpersonal relationships. So, this can go on, if it's not treated, for years and years and years. So it's a very serious disorder, and we're seeing more and more of it. But I would say certainly sexual assault would be one of the prime causes or traumas associated with PTSD.
Now, in your report, there's a number besides that diagnosis, 309.81. What's that a reference to?
So the numbers associated with each of those diagnoses are the numbers that you would find in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. It's just simply a way of recording for purposes of keeping records what the diagnosis is. So that would be something found in a chart, and it would immediately tell someone who knew the manual what it was.
And that's the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders is one of those standard pieces of literature that would be used by psychologists and psychiatrists alike, correct?
That's right. It's basically the manual we use in the United States for mental illness.
And how did you reach that diagnosis with Ms. Harris?
Well, so the PTSD, she reported to me during the interview that she had a lengthy history of being sexually abused by her father. This went on for a couple of years, and it was, she was unable to sort of escape. She was afraid. So that was the kind of the signal trauma of that she relayed to me and others in the past, I will say. The other symptoms that were present were many of the ones that I had mentioned about PTSD. So she showed this flashback. She, for a long time in her youth, she was avoided being around older men. She had intrusive thoughts about the sexual assault, and generally showed other symptoms that are commonly associated with PTSD. So it was a pretty classic presentation.
And those symptoms and those issues that she relayed to you, were you able to corroborate some of that with the other people that you spoke with?
Well, there was not a lot of evidence in the record of this sexual assault. It was noted in 2 other evaluations, one done by another psychologist sometime earlier, and then one done by a behavioral health group who did an evaluation with Ms. Harris prior to her arrest in October of 2017.
The symptoms that you described generally about post-traumatic stress disorder, it appeared to you that Ms. Harris was also showing some of those symptoms as well, specifically, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Now, let's talk about the second diagnosis of stimulant use disorder. I think you described it as substance abuse, but can you flesh out that definition a little bit better, maybe as it relates to addiction or why people use?
Well, Ms. Harris reported a long period of time where she was using methamphetamine on a daily basis and sometimes multiple times a day. And so use of that sort, particularly given its frequency and the clear problems associated with using it and her difficulty in stopping, led me to make that diagnosis. So, for example, she was using it while she was pregnant. Normally, one would be mindful of how you treat your body when you're pregnant. She was using it. So that would be an example where she was just unable to abstain from it. It interfered with her ability to take care of her children. It interfered in her relationships with other people. It generally caused her a great deal of personal harm and harm to others.
Without getting into the specific detail of it, given the reports that you had, the medical records that you had, were you able to corroborate Ms. Harris's methamphetamine use?
Well, probably the most telling piece of evidence that I found in the medical record was the fact that...
Dr. O'Hara, without talking about the specifics, were you able to corroborate?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Sorry to interrupt you, sir. So.
Okay.
You explained some of it, that the methamphetamine use can affect your ability to take care of your children. How does it do that? What happens?
Well, in the case of chronic methamphetamine use, what we know from the literature, that is the scientific research that's been done, is that it has a number of what we would call cognitive effects. And so some examples of the cognitive effects that would impact on anybody's ability to fulfill normal responsibilities of being a parent or really anything else would include problems in attention, so being able to focus on a task, for example. It includes being able to manage one's emotions. So, for example, when we have a problem and we get angry, let's say we're at work, we have a coworker who is giving us a difficult time, we start to feel angry. Most of us, if we are managing our emotions appropriately, are able to think to ourselves, okay, I'm not going to lash out because I know that's going to cause problems for me. So we call that emotion regulation. That's disturbed in methamphetamine or stimulant abuse. We also see difficulties in initiating and maintaining a focus on tasks. Being very easily interrupted in, let's say, trying to make breakfast, where we have to make a series of small decisions, and if our ability to initiate and sustain on a task is impaired, then some of those even simple tasks become disruptive, and we are unable to, or we don't function very well. Another problem is monitoring our own behavior. So it's very important to monitor our behavior in order to get through life relatively satisfactorily. So, for example, if we're trying to take care of a child and we're not really paying attention to what we're doing to take care of the child, a lot of the important things that we might want to do get lost. Another cognitive problem in chronic methamphetamine abuse is impulsivity. So doing things that are unwise, that are done on the spur of the moment without thinking through them, is something we also see. So what we see then is a constellation of problems in our ability to use normal cognition, or something that we call executive function, to execute in our lives. All of these things are disrupted with chronic methamphetamine or stimulant abuse.
Well, let's move on to the first diagnosis, the major depressive disorder. Can you explain what major depressive disorder is?
Well, major depressive disorder is a mood disorder, and it's characterized by the presence of low mood, usually feeling very depressed, or that sense of lack of pleasure in things that are normally enjoyable. So probably all of us have either experienced it or know people who have, who go from being living their lives normally to all of a sudden not being interested in anything, withdrawing from other people. And so a major depressive disorder usually has to be characterized either by prominent low mood or prominent loss of interest or pleasure, and then a number of other symptoms that would include things like feelings of very negative self-worth, or feeling guilty about things that the person wasn't responsible for, feeling like life is not worth living, maybe feeling suicidal, being slowed down or agitated, so it can go either way, difficulty concentrating, thinking, making decisions, disturbances in appetite. These are all symptoms of depression, and when you put them together for many people, particularly if they're at a severe level, it can result in a very impaired functioning, failing to fulfill normal daily responsibilities.
And how did you reach that diagnosis in Ms. Harris's case?
Well, in the case of Ms. Harris, she had had a long history of depression based on our interview, starting probably around the time that she began to suffer this sexual abuse that she had reported. And it sort of cycled on and off for many years. And for various episodes, it was very clear from her report that she had most, or if not all, of the symptoms of depression, including making very serious plans to kill herself at one point. So it was a pretty easy diagnosis to make. It was also corroborated, at least on one occasion, in the medical record.
Not the first time that diagnosis has been applied to her.
That's correct.
Now, let me ask you, what is the significance then of, we have major depressive disorder and then recurrent?
So recurrent simply refers to the fact that the diagnosis isn't the first time it's occurred, that we would have seen similar episodes in the past. So one of the things that we understand about depression is that these episodes for many people come and go, sometimes at a very severe level, other times not so severe. Sometimes there's complete recovery from a depressive episode, but many individuals experience repeated episodes throughout their lifetime.
And then the modifier severe in your diagnosis? Well,
that's sort of a judgment call based on how significant the symptoms are as well as the level of impairment. And it was my judgment that in the totality, certainly her worst depressions were at the severe level, and I would say at the time around the time after Sterling was born, a good bit of that was at a severe level.
And that brings us to the final part of it. It was with peripartum onset. Can you explain the significance of that?
Well, there's been a debate among psychologists and physicians who work with women about this concept of postpartum depression. So in the lay literature, let's say, in the popular literature, there's been a lot of discussion about having a depressive episode that begins after delivery. We see lots of celebrities now will come out and talk about this. It's become notorious in a certain sense. However, one of the problems that we've had in the field is defining exactly when does it occur, how long can it last, can you have a postpartum depression that begins 6 months or a year after delivery? We know that a lot of these depressions actually, in fact, begin during pregnancy, in a few cases maybe even before that. So the American Psychiatric Association, which is the body of psychiatrists that put together the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, in the latest version of it basically said peripartum onset means that the episode began sometime during pregnancy or as late as about 4 weeks after delivery. Whether that actually defines a unique depression or not, we don't really know, but that's what it means.
Kind of gives you a starting point, is that right?
Right.
Okay. Now, if that can give you a starting point, how long can depression last? Is there a timeline, or can it last for months? Or
These episodes can last for a very, very long period of time if a woman isn't treated appropriately with either psychotherapy or some sort of a medical therapy. There was a time when these kinds of severe depressions led to years-long hospitalization for women in state psychiatric institutions. But with modern treatments, we've been able to avoid doing that. But these women, particularly when they have severe depressions, certainly do need to be treated to shorten the length of the episode.
Now, let's say you have somebody that has multiple children, or has given birth twice. Is there a significance if the woman suffered from postpartum depression after the first child as it relates to any diagnosis after a second child?
When we're looking at factors that we think increase risk for postpartum depression, certainly having had one following the birth of an earlier child, that does increase the risk. It certainly is not a risk of absolute, but it is certainly a risk factor.
It actually might make postpartum depression more likely.
That's right. It does make it more likely. Yes.
Okay. And was that part of the diagnosis or something you took into account in this case?
Well, it certainly was relevant in understanding her situation, and it gave me a little bit more confidence that what we were talking about was major depression, that it had been recognized by a medical professional at some point in the not too distant past.
The depression, I know that you talked about some of the symptoms that occur when someone is severely depressed. I always think about it in terms of somebody that doesn't even want to crawl out of bed that day, that sort of thing. Can it impact a relationship or relationships that individual may have differently, say, between children or adults?
So, one of the major consequences of depression that we see for individuals who are in relationships, so this would be partners, this would be children, is that these relationships are often very impaired. That individuals who are very depressed often are very irritable, they're very difficult to get along with. The depressed individual is not going to be very attentive to the relationship, might be in a situation where he or she, in this case a she, would neglect household responsibilities and generally not function at a very high level, certainly requiring help and support. And one of the things that we often see when a woman is depressed in the postpartum period is others kind of rally around her to what we call support her or help her out given her evident difficulty. So in the absence of that kind of help, those problems can become very severe.
Yeah, we've heard in this case, obviously we know of the death of Sterling, but we've also heard some evidence in this case that about Nala, the toddler. Is there a reason that if you're in this depressive state that Nala would do better or thrive versus Sterling?
Well, I mean, Nala was was almost 2 years old at this time. And a child of that age is mobile, is able to speak, express herself in Nala's case. And so I wouldn't say she's not going to fend for herself, but she can make her needs known to her parents. Sterling, on the other hand, as an infant, could cry, but there really wasn't much else that he could do. So it's not terribly surprising that Nala would not have been affected as much, but I would not argue that she was unaffected by all of this. There was an evaluation done of her, and it was pretty clear that there were significant problems that were identified by the social workers who did that evaluation. And I don't mean physical per se, but psychological.
And since I believe you testified earlier that one of the symptoms that can exist with depression is you lose the ability to find pleasure in things, and even pleasure in caring for your children or pleasure in your children, period. Because Nala was mobile, she was more able to at least grab the attention of Ms. Harris. Is that right?
That's right. And in fact, Ms. Harris communicated during the evaluation that Nala was very irritable with Nala, probably because Nala was making demands on her that for attention and probably for food too.
Backing up now to the three diagnoses, do they interplay? Is it significant that there are three? Do they magnify each other? Do they come and go at different times? What's the significance of the three together?
Yeah. Well, my understanding of the timeline of the mental health problems that Ms. Harris experienced was that the PTSD, the trauma experience with her father, started a chain of events probably that led to the PTSD, to depression when she was a youngster. There is also evidence in the record that she was using marijuana at one point. She was actually doing some cutting of her wrists. So she was, even in her youth, was showing quite a bit of disturbance. And as near as I can tell, it was when she met her partner, Mr. Cohn, that she began to use methamphetamine at his encouragement or insistence. The methamphetamine would have been, and the marijuana would have been both examples of using drugs to probably help manage distress, pain, if you will, and it became something that she could turn to alleviate some of her suffering. From the major depression, from the effects of the PTSD, and the miserable circumstances of her life. So all of those things together, yes.
Thank you, sir. I don't have any other questions.
Cross-examination.
Doctor, would you agree that someone suffering from a severe major depression, it's a global and systematic impairment?
I think that's fair to say.
That normally affects all aspects of their life?
Well, at a certain point, if it's severe enough, it will. But even severe depressions don't necessarily show impairment across every domain. But there are depressions that get so severe that a person essentially might take to bed and do nothing else. But most individuals with even severe depression are doing something, but usually in a very ineffective manner.
And generally, they have difficulty caring for themselves sometimes.
That's true.
They have difficulty caring for others sometimes.
Correct.
Difficulty communicating.
Yes.
Difficulty doing basic, simple things in life.
Yes.
sometimes like getting out of bed,
Yes.
bathing themselves,
Yes.
feeding themselves.
Sometimes, yes.
And a lot of those factors can also be symptoms of drug use too, correct?
Some of those, certainly.
Now, when you did this evaluation, you wanted an idea of the defendant's mental state during the month of August 2017, correct?
Yes.
Okay, and when did you meet with her?
I met with her on December 18th of last year.
So December 18th of 2018.
That's correct.
Okay, now, is it fair to say that the majority of the information that you received and that you relied on for your opinion was regarding her depression, was her statements, what she told you?
The majority, yes.
So you had to take what she told you as true.
Well, there is always the possibility that someone will be untruthful with you when you're doing an evaluation. Given the story and its complexity, I judged it to be largely true. But it is the case that it was largely based on her report to me.
And you testified earlier that it's not a normal thing for you to do forensic evaluations of persons who are facing court proceedings.
That's correct.
Now, specifically, some of the facts, you've read the police reports and all those types of things, correct?
That's true.
Okay. So during the month of August, during the month of August, Ms. Harris was able to clean the house.
Are you asking me?
Yes. She actually talked to you about that, didn't she?
Yes. So, yes, she was able to clean the house.
She fed Nala.
Yes.
She bathed Nala.
I don't necessarily have a recollection of that. It's possible it's in the report, but I don't have a recollection of that.
There was a dog in the house that needed taken care of.
I will have to rely on your memory of all of the police reports. That's not in my report.
Did you look at any of the photographs of the home?
Yes.
Okay, so you were aware that there was toys and things for entertainment for Nala.
Yes.
She took the time during that month to take drugs, correct?
That's right.
You can see from the phone records that she talked frequently and consistently with Zach.
That is one element of the record I did not examine, so I can't really speak to that.
Okay. So if you were to know that she texted and spoke frequently with Zach, and that she texted and spoke frequently with her mother during that time frame in August, does that change your opinion at all?
Well, I would have to see the nature of the text, the amount. I just don't really know. I think it is important to note in this context that she was frequently using methamphetamine, which is a stimulant, so it doesn't surprise me that she was activated in doing some things. I would argue that she was not showing very good judgment a lot of the time, but the drug use certainly complicated an evaluation of how all of this affected her behavior.
So methamphetamine as a stimulant probably aided her in getting things done.
In some cases.
Were you aware, have you seen any of the Facebook records?
I'm sorry?
The Facebook records?
I did not see the Facebook records.
Okay. So when you made this evaluation, you weren't aware that she was posting fashion photos on Facebook?
No.
And you weren't aware that she was posting pictures of her dog on Facebook during August of 2017?
No.
All right, let's talk about some of the statements that she made to you during your interview. She told you during the interview that she was not allowed to text or call her mother, correct?
That's what she said.
In fact, your report states that there was no contact between the defendant and her mother from August 5th up until the time of Sterling's death, correct?
Yes.
And why did you write this in your report? How did you have that information?
Well, her mother said that that was the last time she had seen the two children.
The weekend of August 5th.
Yes. And I believe that Ms. Harris had commented that she was restricted from having contact with her family.
In fact, she told you that she wasn't allowed to talk to anyone. Is that right?
Other than Zachary Cohen's family members, cousins.
And you didn't take the time to look at the phone records to see if that was correct or not?
I don't think it's fair to say I didn't take the time. If I had been, the material made available to me was quite voluminous and not very well characterized, so I didn't really realize that that information was there.
Well, would it change your opinion at all if you knew that she did have numerous texts and phone calls with her mother during that time frame, despite her telling you that she didn't?
Well, I think if knowing something about those contacts would be informative, but without any more information than that, it would be just difficult for me to say.
Okay, so she was making plans with her mother to watch the kids the weekend of Sterling's death.
Yes, that I do know.
Okay. If she was talking to her mom about how they found some mattresses cheap and they wanted to sell some of them for money, what does that tell you?
Well, that she was interested in getting a mattress.
What about if she was asking her mom about insurance and what's the best insurance to get?
Yeah.
Now, you talked about how she had this postpartum with Nala. Was that based on what she told you?
It was based on the Cresco Hospital records and the diagnosis of postpartum depression and the prescription for antidepressant medication.
Okay. Now, did she also tell you that the doctor prescribed that as a preventative medication and that she took it for a week and didn't continue taking it?
Well, she said that it made her feel sick, so she stopped.
And you're aware from the facts of the case that Nala survived infancy and she was a happy, healthy girl at almost 2 years?
Well, she certainly survived. Whether she was happy, I think, given the evaluations done of her after Sterling's death, one might question that.
Now, in your discussions with the defendant, you would agree that she was fairly emotionally dependent on Zach, correct?
Correct.
She expressed love for Zach, at least during that time of August 2017.
That was my understanding, yes.
She worried a lot that Zach was having an affair.
That's correct.
She wanted Zach to be home more.
Yes.
And she was very assertive with Zach that he needed to be home more. Is that right?
I don't know that she was assertive, but she clearly wanted that.
And again, you didn't read the texting and the phone records, correct?
That's correct.
Zach's opinion and what Zach thought of her was important to Cheyanne, wasn't it?
Yes.
She was fully aware during August of 2017 that Zach did not believe that Sterling was his child.
That's correct.
She was fully aware that Zach loved Nala.
I'm sorry?
She was fully aware during August of 2017 that Zach loved Nala.
I don't know that I could substantiate that.
But she did let you know that even though Zach wouldn't have anything to do with Sterling, he would play with Nala and spend time with her.
Yes.
In fact, Zach would take care of Nala at times, just him and Nala, correct?
Correct.
And throughout her relationship, you saw through the records and talking to the defendant, she always chose Zach over her family.
Yes.
Her mother allowed the defendant to stay with her right before Sterling's birth, correct?
Yes.
And even prior to that, Cheyanne always had a place to go home to with her mother, isn't that right?
I don't know that I could say that for sure.
You saw, though, in her history how she bounced back and forth with
Yes.
your mom and Zach.
Yes.
But ultimately, she always went back with Zach, right?
Yes.
In fact, she left her mother's home to go stay in hotels with Zach, with the children.
Yes.
During your interview with the defendant, she admitted to you that she did not want anything to do with Sterling.
She said that. She was, I think, that disturbed, but yes, that was part of the interview.
You say that disturbed. It could be that's just how she felt, though, correct?
Well, that she would be feeling that way about her son, who on another occasion said how much she loved him, that level of impairment in her functioning would be, I would call that quite disturbing.
Her family life was not going good at that time, correct?
Correct.
She felt that Sterling was the cause of that.
I didn't come to that view.
She told you she did not want to change his diapers.
Yes, she did.
She told you that she was tired of hearing him cry.
Yes.
She told you that Nala got mad at her if she was with Sterling.
Correct.
In fact, she told you that Sterling was put in that back room so she didn't have to deal with Nala being upset with her, correct?
No.
And
That's
what
not
did
my
she tell you?
recollection.
What's your recollection?
That Sterling was in that room to deal with his temperature regulation and to have a place for him. Well, the swing was in the room.
So her explanation to you is that she put Sterling in the back room to regulate his temperature?
Well, she had talked to me about the need to keep him appropriately warm in the home. Or if that wasn't said to me, it was in her interview with the sheriff.
Did she tell you, when you spoke with her, did she tell you when she decided to put him in that back room? How long had he been back there?
I'm not sure I know.
Now, she did tell you that she would go into the room every day. Is that right?
I don't know that she said, I don't know that I asked her if she went into the room every day. One might assume that she did with the baby there, but I don't know that it was part of my interview.
Well, you had in your report that the defendant said she would go every day into Sterling's room and give him a bottle.
This is toward the end, yes, that's correct.
What do you mean towards the end?
Well, this was in the month of August, so it would have been the last several weeks of his life.
Okay, so during your interview, she told you that she went in that room and gave Sterling a bottle every day.
Yes.
And if that were true, she saw Sterling every day before his death then.
Probably.
Now, you will admit that if the defendant had this severe depression, that it's unusual that Nala was cared for.
I don't think that's fair to say. Zachary Cohen, the child's father, was involved, so, and again, I would argue that she was not well cared for.
May I approach, Your Honor?
You may.
Do you remember giving prior sworn testimony? Doctor, don't read this aloud, but if you just take a look at this page. starting at line 7 and reading down through line 13 to your actual answer.
Okay.
Does that refresh your memory on what you said previously?
I don't think it is inconsistent with what I'm saying now.
You were asked. Now, you also said it was unusual that she was caring for Nala, but not caring for Sterling. Why don't you just go ahead and read that full answer so we can be clear on that?
All right. Out loud.
Yes, please.
I said that we would expect problems with both children, and my comment was that Nala, being a 2-year-old, was old enough to start making demands on her mother, and Nala was much more in the presence of Cheyanne than Sterling. But yes.
But yes, it's unusual.
Unusual would mean, and you're right, I had said that before, but I think that's maybe an overstatement of what it really means. Nala had problems, and the evaluation of Nala was indicated that by the social workers. So,
but Nala's problems didn't include starving to death, correct?
No, that's correct, of course.
And when you answered that, you're talking about how Nala's old enough to put demands on her mother to get her attention, correct?
Correct.
And you demanding.
Correct.
You'd agree with me that the stench of dirty diapers is demanding.
I would agree.
And you'd agree with me that the reason Sterling wasn't in the defendant's presence was because the defendant placed him in the back room.
Well, Ms. Harris had the child in the back room. That is correct.
You know, we talked earlier about, or I asked you earlier about if you had looked at any of the Facebook records or phone records. If you had seen things in those records that showed frustration or anger that the defendant had towards Sterling, would that make a difference in your opinion?
Well, it wouldn't surprise me that a mother who had the kinds of problems that Ms. Harris had would show anger and frustration with her children, with her partner, with her family. That would not be surprising at all.
Right, so if the defendant sent an instant message to Zach on June 14th, 2017, after he had asked her to call him, and her response was, "I'll call after I'm done cleaning up our damn son," and then sent a picture of Sterling with a dirty diaper, would that surprise you?
Would it surprise me? I don't know that it would surprise me.
Does it change your opinion at all?
No.
Now, Dr. O'Hara, you've never had a forensic practice, correct?
That is correct.
Okay, and you don't have any specialized training in forensic psychology.
That is correct.
In fact, it's been over 20 years since you've done a forensic evaluation of this type.
That is correct.
And you agree that this type of work is typically done by a psychiatrist.
Well, I said that to you once, but that was probably in the absence of actual knowledge. It may be, I actually would say I don't know, quite possibly, but I don't know.
But you'll agree with me that you said in prior sworn testimony.
I did, yes, I did.
That typically these things are done by psychiatrists.
Yes, that's correct.
No further questions.
Redirect.
Just briefly, you had other confirmations of your diagnoses in the record to you, correct?
That's correct.
And whether it's in preparation for a trial or you working at the clinic at the University of Iowa, you would go through the same process to doing the diagnosis, correct?
That is correct.
The fact that ultimately you were asked to testify about it today doesn't change what you do or how you reach the claims that you do, correct?
That's correct. I've been involved in many, many psychological evaluations, correct?
Now, Ms. Timmons
was asking you about what Miss Harris was telling you about how she felt about Sterling, about not wanting to change diapers and that sort of thing. Do you remember that?
Yes.
In your report, however, she prefaced what she told you, didn't she?
Yes.
And did she tell you that now, being sober and looking back on it, I really messed up? I was really messed up.
Yes, that's what she said.
So at the time, that moment of clarity, when she's not high anymore, not having that severe depressive state, she's looking back at it and explaining to you, good grief, what had I done, correct?
That was my understanding.
Did she also tell you that through all that craziness, those crazy thoughts, that she thought her parents were just trying to take her kids away from her?
Yes, she did.
And she said kids, not kid, correct?
Correct.
Thank you, sir. Nothing further.
Recross.
So she recognizes now what she did was wrong?
Yes.
Does she take responsibility for Sterling's death?
That didn't come up in the interview.
That's all I have.
Anything else?
Nothing further.
Can this witness be excused? Or do you wish him to remain around for the testimony of the state's expert?
There is potential for return.
Doctor, you, other than during the testimony of the state's proposed expert, you are still sequestered from the court. Okay. You do need to remain in Plymouth County. Just real quick, as I said on Friday, if it's okay, because we started late, we're going to kind of work through the lunch hour. As it turned out, as I kind of expected, the OWI case that was supposed to go to trial settled yesterday morning, so they didn't have a trial. We could have started at 9, but I couldn't get a hold of all of you and say, hey, get here at 9, so we just went ahead and started at 9. Do you need a recess?
Can we just take a short break, Judge?
We can.
Okay. That doesn't have to be a very long one.
All right. We'll take about 10 minutes.
Rise for the jury.
I did not. Continue to heed the admonition.